Welcome to Women in Western Society. This course is an upper level history class, which means we're going to be doing some primary source work and we're going to be looking at some secondary sources as well as we try to uncover women in the West. Now, your opening screen here has lots of different women from lots of different eras. And with a number of different iconic images that help us to figure out that there's such a variety of women's experience. Now, this is going to be considering Western society. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do the entirety of women's experiences across the entirety across the globe and throughout time. So we're going to focus on the period from Egypt and Mesopotamia through to the early modern period and to the development of feminism. Now, one of the things, because when we study women's history, we're going to have to look at some issues that concern childbirth, that concern sexuality. There are going to be things that are concerning those pieces that we have to talk about. We are going to talk about feminism. In fact, that's going to be one of our first lectures that we talk about this week. Now, when we look at women's history, there are a couple of different problems that we're going to encounter. And some of the biggest have to do with the sources. The biggest issue is the lack of them, particularly when you're looking at the ancient world. Now, one of the things to remember whenever you're studying Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, these eras, these places, and we can extend that even into China and other places, you start running out of sources. Things are destroyed by fire, wind, water, the elements, time, and we just don't have them. Many sources that come to us from the ancient world, we have one copy of. And we have 6% of everything ever written in the ancient world. One of my favorite stories about this is Aeschylus. The complete works of Aeschylus were held in the library at Alexandria. The library at Alexandria was very proud to have the complete works of this famous playwright. They also would not let anyone copy them, take them out of the library. Fortunately, there were people who broke the rules. Otherwise, we would have absolutely nothing of Aeschylus. And what we do have is largely fragments. There are a couple of complete plays, and that's it. That's one of our pieces. It's just simply the dearth of sources. Archaeology gets us to a point, and written history tries to fill in the rest of the gaps. But there are many times when we just simply have to say, we don't know, or we can't prove. The other thing is the types of sources. We're going to look at coinage, numismatics, and epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions. We're also going to have to look at letters and literature and law codes, all of which are great sources. But one of the things that you run into really quickly is the kind of things that are said in your Lefkowitz and Fant book. Women's Life in Greece and Rome. It's a wonderful source book. I love this source book. But they denote that these are men's voices about women. And when it's women's voices about women, or women in the mouths of men, and you hear those phrasings, because what you're seeing reflected there is this debate about male versus female authorship. That this question about whether or not men talking about women is valid. Well, it's an interesting point in the modern world. It's less of a point when you're talking about the ancient world. We do need to make distinctions when we can about who's writing, who's speaking here. But we have to have the male sources, quite frankly, because that's a lot of the sources we have. And also because men's comments about women tell us what was the general idea about women. Not just what this man thought, but these things that become embedded in kind of the ideas. The third kind of problem when we get into sources is the question of bias. Now, there's a difference between bias and perspective. If a source is biased, And if an historian is biased, often what happens is other historians will say, you can't use this source, it's too far gone in one direction, and it's skewed its evidence or its facts so far into to prove its point that it's false. Okay. Perspective is different from bias. Everybody's got a perspective. Okay. Uh, and ancient writers who are going to be primary sources, medieval writers, writers of the 19th century, and contemporary writers are all going to have a perspective. Now, that perspective may or may not affect their ability to do truth, okay? And to tell us what's going on in their society and to lend us a good idea. But we do need to know what that perspective is, because if we don't know what the perspective is, we cannot account for it when we are actually working with the source. So how do you combat the question of the type of sources, the lack of sources, the possibility of bias or perspective in a source? Well, the first thing is to keep track of your own luggage. We've all been to the airport. We know that phrase. Please keep track of your luggage at all times. Well, guess what? That's true when you're dealing with history and almost any subject as well. We all have biases. Some of us have steamer trunks, like these guys. Some of us have carry-ons. But everybody's got baggage. And we need to know what ours are. We need to know what our baggage is in order to keep it in check, to know what it is, and to not let it spill out all over our conclusions. We're still going to have trouble with it, but we at least need to know what it is. Misogyny is a problem. And if you're not certain what misogyny is, it means the hatred or the hatred of women. It can also be a pejorative nature towards women. But misandry is also problematic. One of the things that is sometimes prevalent in women's studies programs that they get criticized for is that everything seems to be blamed on men. But a hatred of men or a continual distrust of men, a continual putting down of men is misandry, and it's equally a problem, okay? And so if you've got a source that's doing one or the other, you need to be really careful with it. Because quite frankly, they may be distorting the view, what they're saying because of their own baggage that they're not keeping track of. The second piece that we need to do is remember that the past is like a foreign country. They do things differently there. Many of you have probably traveled abroad, and if you have, you know that even if you go someplace where they speak English, they don't always use the same word for this that we do. In England, it's not a truck, it's a lorry. Your tennis shoes are not tennis shoes, they're sneakers, or they're trainers, more likely. And a trainer is a person, not a shoe, on this side of the Atlantic. Context matters, always. And we need to always make context more important than our own perspective, okay? Because anachronism usually refers to something that's out of place in time. In other words, we're reading Shakespeare and we encounter a clock in the middle of Julius Caesar's Rome. And the clock's not invented to the Middle Ages, so therefore it's out of place. But you can do the same thing with ideas and try to judge a past time by ideas that simply don't exist in their own time frame. Ideas of 21st century the United States don't always work in ancient Mesopotamia. We're in 2020 AD and they're in 2500 BC. We're separated by over 4,000 years. There's some differences. And we got to keep that in mind. We also need to remember that one man's trash is another man's treasure. Looked at one way, this is an absolutely lovely chandelier. Looking a little closer, you might discover that it is in fact made out of paper clips. Not many people would go to the amount of trouble that this indicates that you have done. I think buying a light fixture might have been easier, but if paper clips is what you have, paper clips are what you use. And what that reminds us of is that you don't assume that another society values what you do. It's one thing about putting our ideas on them, but we also have to remember to read about these places by looking at it through their eyes. Now, we can still come to a judgment about whether or not I want to live here, B, whether or not this is a society we should use as a model for anything. But we also have to be careful because they may see something as liberating that we see as oppressive, and so we have to be careful. You need to be holistic. You need to not just look at political sources. You've got to look around at economic sources, at literary ones, at religious texts, at letters and governmental records. You've got to look at all of these kinds of sources in order to create a holistic view of society. We also need to remember that there's a difference between image and reality. We know this. We teach children this. No, what you see on that screen is not real. Okay? We have this conversation a lot with my son. Okay? No, that's just make believe. That's not real. We talk about that. And we know this to be true, but sometimes we can fall into this trap because we see this visual and we can begin to judge ourselves by this visual. Well, we also have to be careful when we do historical research because what we can fall into is the belief that the image that we see in this text is always the reality. Okay? Because sometimes that's not the case. Now, one of the key pieces in all of this is the difference between articulate and inarticulate power. Articulate power is George Washington. George Washington, here he is. George Washington has articulate power. He's a general. He's given command, a specific command with a piece of paper written down. That's articulate power. When he becomes president, he has articulate power. These are the things that you can do. Now, there is also such a thing as inarticulate power, i.e., Martha Washington over here. Does Martha Washington have influence? Absolutely. Does she have power? Sure she does. Is it written down? No, it is not. But inarticulate power, the ability to influence events, to shape events, to change someone's mind, that's not written down anywhere, but is often an incredibly powerful thing. George Washington, for instance, has a lot of power and authority that isn't written down. He actually does things that no other president does. One of which is lead troops into battle while being a sitting president. We would frown on that now. In order for Eisenhower to run for president, he had to resign his commission because we developed those rules by that point. Not in Washington's time. And we know also that many presidents do things that are not strictly spelled out in the Constitution, but they manage to get away with them by force of personality. Articulate versus inarticulate power. And inarticulate power is incredibly important when we're talking about women. Because very often women's authority, women's ability to influence their lives and the lives of others is not through articulate positions. Those are kind of articulated positions, often are not theirs. But that they sometimes have them, as we'll see. But that doesn't mean that they don't influence things tremendously and shape their worlds. Okay? We're going to look at law, literature, art, law codes, numismatics, as I mentioned. Numismatics is the study of coins, and religious texts. But once again, remember, what you see in this one sermon that's railing against women being an authority, i.e. John Knox, okay, or this image of this woman on a coin, well, Queen Elizabeth's picture is on the money in England, but it's a picture from like the 1960s. Okay? She doesn't look like that at 94. But they aren't always going to change all the money. So we have to be careful about those sorts of things. The images that you see here are often constructed to show us what we the artist or the regime in charge wants us to see. We have to ask why there is a law. Does that mean that somebody's breaking it? We have a law here that says you need to only go 55 on this road. Does that mean there was already somebody going 70 on it? Is this image reality? That's true in law codes. Law codes show us the boundaries of things, but they don't always show us what's going on in between those boundaries or how those boundaries are bypassed. We can see reality more through things like law courts, through tax records, and indirect sources like letters. Sometimes we can see it through religious texts, but we also have to look for layers in a source. Layers that show us what they're assuming in a source that you already know, and things they won't directly tell you. Okay? One of the best examples of this that I want to finish up this particular segment with is the law of coverture. Now, coverture you probably have heard of, but probably not necessarily that term, unless you've taken Dr. Wilwara. Coverture is a doctrine or a law that was in a reality in some places even into the 20th century. It just depends on when and where you're talking about and what kind of element of this you're discussing. And the idea is that a married woman's identity is subsumed into that of her husband. Okay? That by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least it is incorporated and consolidated into the husband. Now, if this seems long-winded, it is. She is under cover, so she becomes, as it's used in the French, a femme couverte, versus a femme sole, which is a solo woman who is in fact able to conduct business on her own and in her own right. But a femme couverte is actually being covered in someone else's identity. Now, in English law, and eventually in American, that usually meant the husband, but it could also mean the father or a brother, okay? And this has lots of echoes in lots of places. But nowhere do you find this nice, neat, clean thing here. So this says women can't act on their own. Women can't be in all the legal rights and disabilities. And these are personal rights. They simply don't have them. So Mrs. John Smith can't hold property or be involved in court because, well, Mr. John Smith is the guy, and her only identity is Mrs. him. Okay? This is an old kind of way of referring to things, and it's not all that uncommon. But this is a lot more complicated than it looks at first blush. Okay? Because the doctrine of coverture, which is railed against by Abigail Adams and others in the late 1700s, is a little more complicated than some people let on. Because the rest of that particular passage there says this: a woman indeed may be attorney for her husband. Wait, what? Wait a minute. It's a representation of her husband or her lord and husband, but she can be his attorney. If he's not there, he can be her representative in court. He can represent her. She can represent him in lots of different ways. Now, women could appear in court and did as married women for their husbands. That's a pretty significant sort of things.
Do you mind if we finish the movie?
There was also another piece to this, which is not just the business of can they appear in court, because they did. Now, it was not considered really great if a woman had to be on the witness stand, but she certainly could represent her husband and her family's interest if it was necessary. There was also what was known as the law of necessities, again, from the same fairy passage that we just read a second ago. The husband is bound to provide his wife with necessaries by law. If she contracts debts for them, he is obliged to pay them. However, if she runs off, he's not. Okay. And if the wife is indebted before marriage, the husband is bound to pay the debt. Okay. Now, this is a pretty significant thing because women are actually going to exploit all of these pieces. Women are able to go into the marketplace, they conduct business, anything for the necessaries of life. The necessaries of life include food, clothing, furniture, draperies. I mean, any of these pieces. She can conduct business for anything in her household and does. Okay. That's not quite as limited as that first law makes us think. They also exploit debt law. There were many instances of women who would, as femme souls, would run up debts that they couldn't pay. So what do we do now? Well, I go over here to the prisons where I've got single men in prison for debt. Nothing worse can happen to them. And I'm going to contract a marriage with them. And now they are legally responsible for my debt. And when the creditors come knocking on my door, I refer them to my husband who's already in debtor's prison. Now that's woman moving inside this law. This law is still shaping daily life, but they are using it to their advantage. In other words, they're making a lot of lemonade out of this. Okay. Women also exploited debt and law of necessities, or necessaries law in a lot of different ways. Women who were separated from their husbands, which could and did happen, still made their husbands pay for their upkeep. And the courts actually supported them in this. And they took their husbands to court in the English court system in the 18th and in the 19th centuries. It was still possible. So why is this law, it's still problematic. Okay, don't get me wrong. It still limits a woman in very many ways, to the point that in the 1950s, when credit cards are coming out, a woman couldn't get a credit card in her own name until about 1970. Okay. But so there are still lots of problems, but there are also ways around it, which you don't always hear when this is discussed. Well, part of it is the question, where did this law come from? Often this is called an Anglo law, a law that comes out of common law. English common law, and of course France, of course, doesn't have this. They're so much better. This is going to be something that's put out by Mary Wollstonecraft, that the laws that apply to a woman's property in England don't apply in France, and therefore I'm going to go to France and be more liberated. Now, her real liberation comes from the fact that she won't marry the guy she's living with, okay? And that's how she maintains her hold on her property. The reality is most scholars now don't think that coverture actually had its origins in the Norman conquest, which was a theory for a while, or really in medieval common law. Because one of the things that we find is, while men had control of women's property, a woman could, in fact, inherit property in her own right. Even in France, where they argued that women couldn't inherit, they still did. And this is still a piece of women were in the marketplace and were actors in the marketplace on a regular basis in their own right, still in many places in the Middle Ages. So we have to be really careful with this. But those passages that I read for you just a minute ago are not from a law book. They're not even from a court decision. They're from Sir William Blackstone. He's one of the most formidable and famous commentators on English law in all of English history. And between 1765 and 1770, he published a series of commentaries on English common law. In other words, he interpreted the law. He did serve as a judge at a time, but this is his actual commentaries. And what happens is his commentaries come to be the way the law is interpreted for the 18th century and the 19th century and into the 20th, before it is completely dismantled. And suffragettes and suffragists, women suffragists who were working towards the right to vote and more freedom, attacked coverture using Blackstone. And it was a famous rhetorical target. This is what they went after, where they attacked that, this woman's purse was stolen, but it's actually not her purse. This is Mrs. Caroline Norton. It was not her purse, it was her husband's purse. How embarrassing. And they make PR out of this. And quite frankly, the women's suffrage movement was very, very good at PR. And the reality was, this wasn't just Anglo-American law. There were manifestations of this certainly amongst the Greeks. We see this to a point amongst the Romans, though not totally. We see it amongst the Dutch, the French, and particularly in the Code Napoleon, will establish more guardianship for women and children under French law. And so you see lots of pieces of this in lots of different ways. In other words, the narrative is complicated. And it should be. If someone's selling you a one-size-fits-all answer, you need to remember your Princess Bride. Life is pain, Highness, and anybody who says differently is selling something. Well, in the realm of historical thought, if you get somebody arguing for one single cause, be very, very suspicious. And even with this, you have to be careful, because coverture, while it was a reality, there was a lot more going on here. And that's what we're going to do, is we're going to complicate the narrative. So hang on to your seats, folks, and we'll see you soon.